Hey Forge members, Anthony here, and welcome to the 6th tutorial in our React series. Today we are going to learn about BrowserRouter and how to use it. What is BrowserRouter, you ask? Well, BrowserRouter is what allows a website to do the following. Let's say we have a single page application, just like the React org docs. If I were to click tutorial, we would see that the information on the page, the components on the page change, as well as the URL. In fact, the component that is displayed on the page matches up with whatever the URL is. So we're going to learn how to set different paths and map different components to them using BrowserRouter. Before we begin, I want to give a huge shout out to this tutorial made by Paul Sherman. He gave me sort of the building tools for this entire tutorial, so I highly recommend, if you still don't understand things by the end of this tutorial, definitely check out his blog and check out his tutorial. Now, let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to create a new React app, and let's call this one a router tutorial. The whole idea of why we're creating different projects every single tutorial is that by the end of this series, you should have a number of files that teach you a lot of different separate things about React. Oh, it looks like you can't actually have capitalizations, so we'll just change that to router tutorial with a lowercase t. And at the end of this series, we're going to make a huge project that uses everything we've learned so far in the series. So while that runs, the first thing that is worth noting is that we are going to be using, for the first time, an external dependency. So you're going to see once the Create React app finishes, we're going to go ahead and we are going to install the React Router DOM. Now, it's worth noting that there are a couple of different packages you can use, but the simplified version, so for example, you have React Router, you have React Router DOM, and then you have React Router Native. So React Native is for iOS and Android application. So if you're making a website or a web app for Android or iOS, that's when you would use React Native. Now, React Router DOM, this library, is built on top of the React Router library, and this is the one you should use whenever you're trying to make a web project. So we're going to go ahead, and in here we're going to go into our router tutorial directory, and we're just going to type npm install -- save react-router-dom, just like the documentation here says. Now, when it comes to React Router, there are two main types of routing. One is called browser routing, and one is called hash routing. Now, the difference is as follows. When you're using browser routing, your URL is more of a path. When you use hash routing, your URL will usually look something like this, and you've probably seen this. Let's say, for example, if we go to GitHub, and we go to some documentation, let's say for Create React App, you can see here if we wanted to link. Let's see if this one has it. For example, if we wanted to link the philosophy of this, the URL would look like this, and then we would have a hashtag philosophy. This is known as hash routing. It's especially useful when you want to link the user to specific sections on a given web page. So if we wanted the user guide, we can see here the URL would be hashtag user guide. If we wanted the what's included to be linked whenever someone opens the page, we have the hashtag what's included. So that is what a hash router is, and we're not going to go into a hash router this project, but we may cover it in a future tutorial. So let's go ahead and open our directory here. It's in this directory, so here we go. So as usual, the first thing we're going to do is get rid of our templated stuff. So we don't need this logo. We don't need the app.test.js. Inside of our app, we can delete the reference to the logo, and we can pretty much get rid of all of this stuff in here. And gone. So now if I were to just maybe put an h1 and say, something like welcome to our browser router tutorial. then we should see this when we start our React application. So as you can see here, welcome to our BrowserRouter tutorial is being displayed. A good note to have is you'll actually get, if you try to run your React app while a dependency is installing, a lot of times you'll get an error. So just make sure your React router DOM finishes installing before you actually try running it. And if you did, you can just Control-C the React project. So if I wanted to stop this, I just hit Control-C if you're on a Mac, and it'll stop it, and then you can restart it just like that. So before we get into the browser routing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new component for the header. So let's call this header.js. And I'm also going to create a new component for the home page, so home.js, and then for the directory.js. And in each one of them, I'm just going to use our plugin we have for VS Code to create a default component settings for it. So as you can see here, so let's say something like h1, or let's make it h2, so it differentiates. Oops. This is our directory, and now we're just going to do the same thing for every other component we just created. This is our home page. Or let's spice it up a bit, actually. Let's write something like welcome to the Forges website. Cool, and we'll make sure we save that. And then for the header, we're just gonna create another component. Header, and we're gonna say h2. This is the header. And essentially, in our app, let's go ahead and import the header. So import header from header. I'm going to display it up here. So header. It's a pretty crappy header for now, but it should be fine. So, and inside of our header, let's create two URLs, so two buttons. Button. And this one will say home, and then this one will say directory, because we're going to have two different places you can go from our header. Okay. Oh, whoops, we put this in the home component. So just put that in the directory. Cool. Oh, sorry, the header. Cool. So we now have a home and directory button, but they don't do anything. So let's make it so our initial path is going to be our home. So if someone just comes to your website.com and they first land there, we want them to go to home, and if they click the directory, it'll change the URL and show them the directory instead of the home. So let's go ahead, let's come back to our app.js. We can get rid of this header, and let's add both of those components in here first. So let's import home from /home. Let's import directory from /directory, and let's go ahead and make a component in here for both of them. Cool. So now we have the home and the directory both displaying at the same time. So now we're going to finally start using BrowserRouter. So the first thing we need to do is we need to wrap our entire project in BrowserRouter component tags. So usually you would want to do this on the highest level component. So you would even want your app component to be wrapped around in it. So we're going to go and open our index. And in our index, we can see here we actually call the app component. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import the BrowserRouter component. So we're going to type import, and we're going to wrap the BrowserRouter in squiggly brackets. And the reason we do this is because whenever we want to import something from another file, we can get away with not using the squiggly brackets if the thing we are trying to import is the default export. So as you can see here in our app component, we are exporting default app, which means if we were to just export app from this component, this is the only thing that would get exported. However, with most libraries, as you'll see, they export many different things, and there is no default. And when you're exporting, when you're trying to import a specific export of a file, you want to wrap it around in these squiggly brackets. So we're going to import BrowserRouter from React Router DOM. And we're just going to wrap our app around in our BrowserRouter. We're going to wrap our app around our BrowserRouter tags. So we can see here that this is now done. So this won't actually make a change just yet. What we have to do is we have to actually clarify the routing now in our app directory. So once we declare the BrowserRouter at our top level, at really the top level of our project, anything within the app component or anything that is within the BrowserRouter tags will be able to use browser routing. So now we can come back to our app component and proceed with the next step. The next thing we have to do is import these two components from the BrowserRouter, from the React Router library. So the first one is going to be called switch, and the second one is going to be called route. And we're going to take this from the same library. Now, what we're going to do is we have, as you can see in our app component, we have the home and directory components. And these two components, we don't want them to coexist at the same time. We don't want to be showing the user our home page as well as the directory at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap them around a switch tag. And what this switch tag will do is it will allow us to actually use our route tags within them. So we can save here, and now what we're going to do is, instead of having this home and directory component, what we can do is we can create a route. And let's first do the home page. We're going to write route exact path. And now for our path, we can set it equal to what we want that URL to be. So for the home component, we want to display it when we are on /, aka the default directory. And now what we can say here is our component is equal to the home component. That's the component we want to display. And now what we can do is we can end these tags. So now we can do the same thing for the directory. And I'm going to explain what all the syntax means in just a second. So for this one, we're actually going to leave out the exact, and I'm going to tell you why. And let's say we want the path here to be directory and the component to equal directory. And now if we go back to our web app, we can see here that since we are on our default path, aka / aka nothing, the only thing that shows is our home directory. And let's make it a bit more obvious. This is our home directory. And then for this one, we can write something like h3. This is our. Oh, we already wrote that. This is our employee directory. So we can see here, since we're on this default path, it says welcome to the Forges website. This is our home directory. Now if I add the / here and I write directory, you can see here we actually get to the employee directory. And it also works, just for your own note, it also works for lowercase, so it's not case specific. Now, these buttons don't work yet because we haven't hooked them up to anything, and we'll do that in just a second. But first, let's understand the syntax that we're using within our app. So essentially, what we are saying here is whenever our path is equal to / directory, we want, or whenever our path contains this / directory at the top level, we want to display this component directory. So you'll see here, if I also type /directory /ASDF/ASDF/ASDF, it'll still take us to our directory because the top level URL contains this / directory. Now, the reason we had to use the exact path here is because every single one of our other paths will always contain this /. So the exact keyword makes it so if our top level if our path is not exactly what is written in these quotation marks, it will not show there. And you'll see if we actually take away that exact, what will happen is we will always get the home directory no matter what, because it is the first thing that a slash is contained in every single other ones, and it is the first route that is being run in this switch between these switch tags. So, and that is why we have to put the exact tags. Now, if you also you could also do the same thing for directory. For example, if you don't want directory slash all of this other stuff to show the directory, you can simply use the exact. That way, it'll only show the directory if slash directory is the only thing that is there. But for our purposes, and for the example we're going to do later on, we're going to leave that in. So now let's go and learn about how to make these buttons work. So I want it, whenever I click this home directory, it will bring us back to this. And whenever I click the directory, it'll bring us back to the employee directory. So let's go back into our header. First of all, let's make this button a bit more clarifying. So we'll make this employee directory, and we'll call this the home page. So in home, I'll make it, this is our home page, just so it's like as least confusing as possible. So welcome to the Forge website. This is our home page. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create on-click handlers for our buttons here. So over here, we're going to say handle click home, and then, so we're just going to create a function for that. I'm going to handle click employee directory. Okay, and in both of these functions, so let's make it the onClick. So onClick equals this dot handle click home, and the same thing for this one, except with the other function. Okay, now what we want to do, essentially, all we have to do within these functions is simply change the URL to whatever we want it to be, and that will change whatever is being displayed on our page. Because remember, the component that is currently being displayed over here is dependent on this URL. So if we change the URL, this component will change. There are a couple of ways to do this URL changing inside of React. And one of them is to simply create maybe an anchor or a link tag and just have it link to the specific URL that we're trying to achieve. But the more official way to do it with BrowserRouter is to use something called history.push. So the syntax for it looks like this: this.props.history.push, and then the URL we're trying to push to. So for example, if we want to click home, we want to just push it to the base URL, which is just a slash. And the same thing goes for the employee directory, except we want to go to directory. Now, this alone isn't enough, however. We'll see if we come back to our React app and we were to click it, it doesn't actually do anything, because the history prop is actually undefined. So the history prop actually comes from the BrowserRouter library, and in order to give a component access to this history prop, we have to use another component or a modifier from the React DOM library called withRouter. So we can go ahead and import withRouter from React router DOM. Now, the way we use this is a bit different than you've seen before, and this ties in last video when I was talking about, or the video before that when I was talking about why you should put this export default at the bottom. And the reason is sometimes you're going to want to modify the component when you mount it with specific modifiers like this withRouter. So for example, if I were to put withRouter, if I were to wrap this header tag around withRouter, what that does is it will pass in this history prop into the header as the header is being rendered. So now if we come back and we try that again, we will see that these buttons actually work now. The history prop is actually being passed in from that withRouter functionality that we just implemented. And now you can see we have a fully functioning employee directory and homepage and routing that allows us to do it. So if we were to even open up incognito and pass that in here, we would see that we would go to the employee directory page, and same with the homepage, and the URL changes, and nothing but this component on the inside is being re-rendered. So now let's go a bit deeper. Let's say, for example, I'm sure you've seen websites or even tools like Bitly where depending on a certain variable at the end of the URL, it takes you to a different page. So for example, let's say we had an employee called Bob. If we went to directory/Bob or directory/1, which could be Bob's employee number, it would take you to his profile. Let's go into how we do that. Normally, all this stuff would come from a database. And since we haven't gone over how to connect React with a backend like Express and connect Express with a backend like Firebase or anything, what I'm going to have to do, just for the sake of this video, is create sort of a fake API connector that will allow us to get this fake employee data, just to show you guys how it would be done. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to call this like employee API.js. And in here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a const employees, and I'm just going to create a list of employees. So each employee is going to be a list. So for example, name, let's say ID is going to be 1. Name is, our first employee is going to be Bob, and he's going to be a software engineer. And we're going to just copy and paste this 3 times, so we'll have 3 employees. Let's get Stephanie in here again. She'll be the CEO. And then we'll have, let's say Steve, and he's going to be the CTO. And we can just go ahead and save that here. Now, I'm going to make 2 functions. One of them is just going to return all the employees, so a list of all the employees. And one of them is going to return the specific employee that matches an ID parameter. So let's go ahead and create a const get all employees is going to be equal to, we're not going to pass anything in. And all we're going to do is return employees. And we can export that. And now the second thing, we're going to export the second function as well. Const get employee by ID. And we can pass in an ID parameter. And what we can do is we can return the employees dot filter. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript or the filter function, filter will go through a list and it will check a conditional statement on every element in that list. And if the condition is true, it will append it to the new list. And if it is false, it will not. So ID in this list is unique. So if we filter based on ID, ideally we should always have, or we should have no more than one person in the final list that we return. And if the employee doesn't match anyone, it'll just return an empty list as well. So what we can do is we can create a map or filter by the parameter employee and just say filter function return employee.id is equal to ID. So we're saying if the employee ID is equal to the ID we are querying for, then we're going to return true, aka we're going to append this to the end the end array that this filter function is going to make, and then we're going to return the whole entire thing. So now let's go ahead and test this, let's say in our header component. So we can go ahead and import the 2 functions. So first let's import get employee by ID, and make sure we put the squiggly brackets because we are exporting each one of these functions individually and there's no default export. And then we are going to import the other one from /employees thing, and let's just test it. So let's say below these 2 buttons, let's just display, let's have an H4 to display get employee by ID, and let's pass in the parameter 1. So we're going to get the first employee, and remember this is going to return an array, and you can't actually display these type of objects within React. Well, here, I'll show you. If we try to display it, we're going to get an error here. So if I come back, oh, sorry. we have to pass it in as a string because I set the employee things as a string. So now if we come back, we're going to get this error, objects are not valid React children. So we actually have to get a specific element from this array that we've gotten. Now, remember, it returns an array, and the array that it returns contains a single or zero dictionaries inside of it. So we want the first element, and of that element, we want the name. So we're going to just display the name of the first employee just to make sure everything's working. And that name is Bob. So it should display Bob when we save this. And we come back here, and Bob's name is displayed. And there we go. So we've tested how this works. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and implement this into our directory thing. So let's remove it all from here and move this to here. So in the directory, so import. So we're gonna import the get all employees. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna display all the employees. We're gonna display all the employees, and then when a user clicks on one of those employees, it'll take them to a page where the URL has their employee ID appended to it, and you can see all their information. But for now, we're just gonna display their names. So, and the way to do that is we're going to map through it. And we are going to, so let's create a div. And in here, we're going to create our map. So the first thing actually what we can do is above this return, we can create a const of employee list. So employee list is equal to get all employees. And this isn't in the return. So technically, it's not in our JSX code. It is happening when the component renders. If you remember our last video, we are getting this component when it renders. We could even have this as a state, pass it in as a state in our constructor, but we can put it here instead. And so now what we're going to do inside of here is we're going to create our loop. So employee.map, and we're going to say employee. And then we're going to create, so for every employee in our employee list. And then what we're going to do here is simply write our code. So we can return, and then let's say a div. And then in that div, we can display like the employee name. So employee.name. And if you don't remember the syntax, we used it in the second or third video. So, and then we can say, let's just have that for now. So our employee directory should print out all the employees that we have. So if we go to our employee directory, we have Bob, Stephanie, and Steve. We can go ahead and create the onClick function that we want to happen whenever we click the employee's name. So let's call it handle click employee, and we're going to pass in the ID function. And for now, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to console log it to make sure that it's all working fine. Now within this div, what we want to do is we want to give it an onClick, but something that we haven't covered before is that whenever we want to call something an onClick like this inside of another return function within the render, we actually have to pass in a reference to the function rather than the function itself. If we just pass in the function like this, so we just type in this.handleClickEmployee with employee.id, what will happen is you'll see here, if we go back to our page, it'll actually just run the onClick as soon as it comes in. So the way we solve that is we do this.handle.clickEmployee, so we call it, and then we type .bind, and then we pass in this as a parameter. And what'll happen is it'll it'll call this.handleEmployeeID, and it'll pass in a reference to it with the this prop. So we can come back and we will see that if we click it, it'll display the employee's ID. So it works fine. So now let's go and figure out how to actually create the path void and create a component for our profile. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create profile.js. We'll use our RCC. What we're going to do here, we're just going to move this down to the bottom as we always do. Oops. All right. And now what we can do, simply go ahead and say something like, this is our profile, and then say, let's say, let's give an h5, and then name will be this dot props dot name. So we're going to be passing in all the information from the employee. So their name, we're going to be passing in their role or position. What did I call it in the API? Their role. And then finally their ID. Okay, so that's not going to do anything just quite yet. We haven't hooked it up, and also we're not passing in these props. So the question is, how do we actually get these props into this component, and how do we do the routing associated with it? Well, first, let's come back to our app where our routing is. We want the employee profile to still be in the directory tab, but just another sort of level down. So we would ideally want it to be directory, and then within it, like whatever the ID is. For example, 1 for Bob, 2 for Stephanie, and 3 for whoever the last guy was. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this first directory path to being exact. That way, whenever we have something that adds on to it, it's not going to just show this directory component. So then what we're going to do is we're going to use a specific syntax. And this syntax is whenever we want to have a variable in our URL, we are going to put a colon and then that variable's name. So in this case, the variable we want to show is the employee ID. And we can change this component over to profile. So now, oh, and we need to import it. So import profile from /profile. Now, if we were to come here and we were type in directory -1 or 3, you'll see here that we actually get to our profile page. If we get to 1000, it'll be the same thing. So now, how do we get this information? Well, we just pass it through from our API. So we actually don't need any of this prop stuff, as you'll see. So the first thing we're going to do is create a constructor. We're going to create a constructor, and we're going to call super, and we're going to create a state. Let's also not forget to pass in the props, because we are going to need them. So the question is, so pretty much we want to set the ID equal to whatever this number at the parameter was. And the way we can do that is using yet another prop from the React Router DOM. So we can go ahead, so in order to access that, we know we need the with router. So we can go ahead and import that with router from React Router DOM. And we can come down here and wrap our profile component with the with router. Now the prop we're going to be using is this .props. It's called match.params. And then the parameter we're trying to get. So pretty much this will get us any URL parameters. And if you remember in our index, we set the parameter to ID for this. So we can do .id. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to replace this ID with, instead of this .props ID, we're going to place this .state ID and see if we're actually getting the right value. And as you can see here, we are. Our ID is set to 1000 and our URL here is 1000. If I were to set this to 1, if I were to set this to 1, it would be 1 here. So now with that, pretty much all we have to do, all that's left is to use our API again to get all the employee information by that. So we can go ahead and perhaps we can even do this in the constructor, or if we wanted to, or the component did mount. So let's import, where is it? So let's import get employee by ID, wrap it around from /employee API. Now what we can do here is we can say const employee equals get employee by ID, this .props. We can copy that in there. So we'll prop that in there. Now, remember this will return a list. So we can say if employee.length is greater than 0. We can create a const let's create so let employee ID equals -1 for now, or not found. Oops, not found. Let employee name. So we're just saying default variables. So let employee name equals not found, and then let employee role equals not found. So pretty much, if we type in a parameter that doesn't match, and usually there are a lot more elegant ways to handle this, and this is not how you should be doing it, because obviously we won't be using like some random like pre-cooked API that we made on the side, but this is just to illustrate how the browser router works. So what's going to happen is, if we return a list of greater than 1, aka we found an employee with that ID, all we're going to do is we're going to set those employee variables equal to it. So employee ID equals employee, the first component of the employee dot the ID, and we're going to just do this over and over again. So this one will be for the name, and this one will be for the role. And employee.name, employee.role. And like I said, this is by no means like best standard code. So then all we have to do is set the state. So the ID is equal to this. Our name will be equal to this, and our role will be equal to the role variable. And then we could just change this all to state. And now if we were to go and save it and we come back, we can see here for directory number 1, our employee, the name is Bob, the role of software engineer, and his ID is 1. If we change this to 3, we will get Steve, who is the CTO, with an ID of 3. And if we change this to 3000, which doesn't exist, we will get not found. So I know this has been a really long tutorial. This is longer than most of them. It's longer than I would have liked it to be, but BrowserRouter, it's really important to know how to use it, especially if you're creating any really web app that requires different paths, unless it's literally just a one-page, no URL application. So if you got through it, congrats. Good on you. I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.